Before we begin, let me be clear about what this is. This is historical educational content examining ancient Egyptian funerary practices. The process of mummification involved procedures that modern viewers may find unusual or intense. Everything described is documented historical fact presented for educational purposes. We will examine these practices with scholarly respect for both the ancient culture that created them and the individuals who underwent this preservation. London, the 1830s. The Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. Gas lamps illuminate a crowd in evening dress, women in silk gowns, men in tailcoats. They have paid handsomely for admission, not to a concert or a play, to watch a man unwrap a corpse. The mummy lies on a table at the room's center, 3,000 years old, removed from its tomb 6 months ago, shipped to England in the hold of a merchant vessel. And now, before an audience of 200, the linen wrappings will be cut away, layer by layer, until the body is exposed. Thomas Pettigrew, surgeon and antiquarian, makes the first cut. The crowd leans forward. The outer wrappings are coarse, stained dark with resin. As Pettigrew works deeper, finer linen appears, white, delicate, preserved perfectly in the dry air of the tomb. Between the layers, small objects fall onto the table. Amulets, scarabs, pieces of papyrus with spells written in hieroglyphs no one present can read. The crowd murmurs with excitement. After an hour, the body emerges. The skin is dark, hardened, leathery. The face is sunken but recognizable as human. The hands are crossed over the chest. The fingers are intact, still bearing rings. A woman in the front row faints. She is carried out. The unwrapping continues. Pettigrew makes notes as he works. He identifies the materials, describes the techniques, measures the body. He is methodical, scientific. But the crowd is not here for science. They are here for spectacle, for the thrill of seeing what was meant to remain hidden forever. By evening's end, the mummy is destroyed. 3,000 years of preservation undone in 3 hours. The wrappings are torn. The body is examined thoroughly. Samples are taken for private collections. What remains will be discarded or sold as curiosities. This scene repeated across Europe and America throughout the 19th century. Hundreds of mummies unwrapped before paying audiences. Thousands more ground into powder and sold as medicine. Entire tomb complexes stripped of their contents to furnish museums and private collections. The Victorians were obsessed with Egyptian death. They filled their parlors with artifacts looted from tombs. They wore jewelry made from mummy beads. They painted with pigments made from ground mummies. They held parties where unwrapping the dead was entertainment, but they understood nothing. They saw curiosities, antiquities, objects. They did not see what the Egyptians saw, a technology of immortality, a system refined over 3,000 years, a process so sophisticated that it preserved not just bodies, but souls. Tonight, we will understand what they destroyed. We will trace the complete process of mummification from death to burial. Every step, every tool, every prayer, not as Victorian spectacle, but as the Egyptians understood it, as the most important procedure a human body could undergo. We have extensive documentation, medical papyri describing techniques, tomb paintings showing the process, mummies themselves revealing methods through analysis, Greek and Roman accounts from observers, the archaeological record from embalming workshops. You will learn what happened hour by hour over 70 days, how embalmers transformed a corpse into a vessel for eternity, the physical procedures and the spiritual meanings, the tools and the prayers, the chemistry and the theology. This will be comprehensive. This will be detailed. This will examine ancient practices that involved procedures modern medicine would never employ. But these techniques were developed over millennia by skilled practitioners working within their cultural and religious understanding. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was gentle. The body was systematically prepared for eternal preservation. Mortality was confronted directly. If you value deeply researched content that examines how humans have confronted death, that treats ancient practices with the seriousness they deserve, that explores both physical process and philosophical meaning, then we begin. We begin with death. With the moment when the complex Egyptian understanding of the soul fractures into parts that must be preserved, guided, and reunited. We begin with the end, and the Egyptians' refusal to accept it as final. Chapter 1. Death and the soul's division. The moment of death, ancient Egyptians believed, was not an ending, but a fracturing. What had been unified in life split into separate components, each with its own nature, each requiring specific preservation. The physical body was called Kat. This was obvious. The corpse, the flesh and bone left behind. But the Egyptians recognized that preserving the Kat was essential because other soul components needed it. The Ka was life force. It came into being at birth, lived alongside the person, and continued after death. But the Ka required sustenance, food offerings, drink offerings. Without these, the Ka would starve and cease to exist. The Ka also needed the body. It would return to the tomb to inhabit the preserved Kat. The Ba was personality and consciousness. Depicted as a human-headed bird, the Ba could move freely between the tomb and the realm of the living. During the day, the Ba might fly to places the deceased loved in life. At night, it returned to the tomb to reunite with the body. This nightly reunion was essential. Without it, the Ba would be lost. The Ak was the transformed, glorified spirit. This only came into being if all the funerary rituals were performed correctly. The Ak could dwell with the gods, but achieving Ak status required proper mummification, proper burial, proper offerings, and successful navigation of the underworld. The name, the Ren, was part of the soul. As long as the name was spoken, written, remembered, the person continued to exist. Erasing someone's name from monuments was the ultimate destruction. It killed them more thoroughly than destroying the body. The shadow, the Shut, was another component, less understood, but believed to have independence and power. The heart, the Ib, was not considered a physical organ, but the seat of emotion, thought, and will. The heart would be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of truth. If heavy with sin, the heart would be devoured and the person would cease to exist. If balanced, the person could proceed to eternal life. All these components had to be preserved and protected. The physical body was the anchor. If it decayed, the Ka and Ba had nowhere to return. The soul components would be lost. True death, final death, would occur. So when a person died in ancient Egypt, the family faced urgent tasks. The body had to be preserved. 70 days was standard. During those 70 days, embalmers would transform the corpse into a mummy. And the family would prepare the tomb, gather provisions, arrange offerings, and commission the Book of the Dead spells that would guide the deceased through the underworld. The process began immediately after death. The body was washed in the Nile, not just for cleanliness. The Nile was sacred, life-giving. Washing in the Nile was the first step in transformation. Then the body was taken to the Ibu, the place of purification. This was a temporary structure, often a tent, near the Nile or canal. Here the body would be washed again with natron solution. Natron was a naturally occurring salt, sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, found in desert deposits. Mixed with water, it cleansed. The embalmers themselves were priests. This was not butchery. It was sacred work. They wore masks. The chief embalmer wore the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who presided over mummification and the dead. Others wore masks of minor deities associated with death and preservation. They recited prayers as they worked. Every action had spiritual significance. The procedures performed on the body were ritually significant. So prayers protected both the embalmers and the deceased from spiritual harm. The family had to decide which level of mummification to purchase. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century before Christ, described 3 methods with different costs. The most expensive method involved complete evisceration, brain removal, extended desiccation, finest linens, elaborate masks and jewelry, painted cartonnage, and nested coffins. This was for royalty and the highest elite. The middle method removed some organs, used shorter desiccation, simpler wrappings and plain coffins. This was for the prosperous middle class. The cheapest method involved no evisceration. The body was simply placed in natron for desiccation, wrapped minimally, and buried in simple coffins. This was for the poor. Even the poorest Egyptians sought some form of mummification. Natural mummification occurred in the desert. Bodies buried in sand dried before decomposing. But deliberate mummification, even simple, was preferable. It showed respect. It gave the deceased a chance at the afterlife. For our examination, we will follow the complete process, the method used for those who could afford it. The process that required 70 days, specialized tools, expert knowledge, and unwavering precision. The body has been washed. It lies on a slanted wooden or stone table. The table is carved with channels for fluids to drain. The embalmers gather their tools, and the transformation begins. Chapter 2: Evisceration, the removal of organs. The following describes ancient Egyptian evisceration techniques. This was a necessary medical procedure for preservation. We examine it as historical and scientific fact. The internal organs had to be removed. This was essential for preservation. Organic tissue decays rapidly in warm conditions. Leaving organs inside the body would cause decomposition from within, destroying the preservation work. Only one organ would remain. The embalmer approached the left side of the body. He marked a line with charcoal, approximately 4 inches long, just below the ribs. This is where the incision would be made. He used a knife with an obsidian or flint blade. These materials had ritual significance. They connected the procedure to ancient traditions, but they were also practical. Obsidian can be honed to extraordinary sharpness, creating precise cutting edges. The incision was made cleanly through the abdominal wall. This opened access to the abdominal cavity where the organs were located. Through this opening, the liver was removed first. The liver is the body's largest internal organ. The embalmer carefully separated it from its attachments and extracted it through the incision. It was placed in a vessel for separate preservation. Next came the stomach, followed by the intestines. The human intestinal tract is approximately 30 feet in length, coiled within the abdomen. The embalmer extracted this systematically, section by section, placing it with the other organs. The kidneys and spleen were also removed. Each organ was handled carefully. These would be preserved separately, as each had significance in Egyptian theology. The embalmer then accessed the thoracic cavity through the diaphragm. The lungs, paired organs responsible for breathing in life, were located and removed. First one, then the other. Each was added to the collection of organs for separate preservation. The heart, however, remained in place. Egyptian religious belief held that the heart was the center of intelligence and emotion. The heart would be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of Ma'at. This judgment determined the deceased's fate. Therefore, the heart stayed with the body, essential for the journey ahead. The now empty abdominal and thoracic cavities were washed with palm wine. The alcohol in the wine had preservative properties and cleansed the interior surfaces. Then the cavities were packed with dry natron salt. This would begin the desiccation process from inside the body. The removed organs underwent their own preservation process. They were washed in palm wine and placed in natron for drying. After 40 days of desiccation, each organ would be wrapped in linen and placed in its designated canopic jar. 4 canopic jars were used. Each had a lid carved to represent one of the 4 sons of Horus, protective deities associated with specific organs. The liver was placed in the jar with a human-headed lid. This was Imseti, guardian of the liver. The lungs went into the jar with a baboon-headed lid. Hapi, protector of the lungs. The stomach was preserved in the jar, topped with a jackal head. Duamutef, guardian of the stomach. The intestines were placed in the jar with a falcon-headed lid. Kebasenuef, protector of the intestines. These jars would be sealed and placed in the tomb alongside the mummy. In the afterlife, the organs would be reunited with the body. The person would be whole again. Nothing was discarded. Everything was preserved according to religious protocol. But one organ remained, and its removal required a different approach entirely. The brain had to be extracted through an opening no larger than the nasal passage, and this process required remarkable skill and patience. Chapter 3. The brain. Extraction through the nose. Ancient Egyptians did not understand the brain's function. Modern neuroscience has revealed the brain as the center of consciousness, but ancient Egyptians attributed these functions to the heart. To them, the brain was simply tissue that would decay if left in the skull. Its removal was a preservation necessity, not a recognition of its actual importance. The skull presented a challenge. It could not be opened from above or from the side. The head had to remain intact and undamaged. The face needed to be recognizable. The deceased's identity had to be preserved visually. The solution the embalmers developed was to access the brain through the nasal passage. This required specialized tools and considerable expertise. A long, narrow bronze implement with a hooked end was inserted into the left nostril. The tool was carefully guided upward and backward, following the natural angle of the nasal cavity. The tool encountered the ethmoid bone, a thin structure separating the nasal cavity from the cranial cavity. Controlled pressure was applied. The bone gave way, creating access to the interior of the skull. The brain tissue was then systematically broken down into smaller fragments through careful manipulation of the hooked tool. This process required hours. The tissue had to be reduced to a consistency that would allow extraction. Different tools were then employed. A long, narrow, spoon-shaped implement was used to extract the fragmented tissue through the same nasal opening. Small amounts were removed at a time. The process was repeated until the cranial cavity was empty. Some embalmers used an alternative technique. The body would be positioned face downward, head tilted forward. The liquefied brain tissue would drain from the skull through the nasal opening under the influence of gravity. This method was slower, but ensured more complete removal. Once the brain was completely extracted, the cranial cavity was rinsed with palm wine to cleanse the interior. Then heated resin was poured in. Cedar oil or juniper resin was commonly used. As this cooled and hardened, it coated the interior of the skull, sealing and preserving it. The ethmoid bone, now broken to allow access, would not repair itself, but this did not matter. The opening was internal to the nasal passage. Once the nose was packed with linen during the wrapping process, no external evidence of the procedure would be visible. The extracted brain tissue was not preserved. Unlike the abdominal organs, which were carefully maintained in canopic jars, the brain was simply discarded. The Egyptians saw no religious or practical purpose for its preservation. Modern scientific analysis of mummies confirms these ancient accounts. CT scans reveal empty cranial cavities. Resin deposits are visible at the base of the skull. Damage to the ethmoid bone is consistently present. The historical descriptions were accurate. This is precisely how the procedure was performed. The body was now prepared for the next phase. The longest phase, the one that would determine whether the mummification succeeded or failed. The complete desiccation of all remaining tissue. The transformation from organic matter subject to decay into preserved material that could endure for millennia. Chapter 4. Desiccation. 40 days in salt. The preservation of organic tissue requires the removal of water. Bacterial decomposition cannot occur in the absence of moisture. By removing essentially all water from the body, Egyptian embalmers created conditions where natural decay processes could not proceed. This was sophisticated chemistry, even if the embalmers themselves understood it through practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Natron, a naturally occurring mineral deposit, was the key substance. Found in Wadi Natron, a valley northwest of Cairo, natron consists primarily of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, mixed with sodium chloride and sodium sulfate. This combination proved ideal for desiccation purposes. The eviscerated body was transported from the Ibu to the Wabet, the permanent embalming facility. These structures were built of stone and included working tables, storage areas, and drainage systems. A bed of dry natron was prepared on a working surface. The body was positioned on this natron bed, typically face upward with arms positioned at the sides or folded across the chest. Additional natron was then piled over the body, covering it completely. The body was essentially buried in this desiccating salt. Only markings indicated its position beneath the white crystals. The desiccation process functioned through osmosis. Water molecules moved from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration. The body tissues contained approximately 70% water. The natron contained almost none. Water migrated from the tissues into the surrounding natron. For this process to continue effectively, the water absorbed by the natron had to be removed. Otherwise, the natron would become saturated and cease drawing moisture from the body. This was accomplished through environmental conditions and drainage. The Wabet was constructed in desert locations where atmospheric humidity was extremely low. Water evaporated from the natron surface into the dry air. As surface water evaporated, the natron drew more water from the body to replace it. The cycle continued. The slanted working tables included channels for liquid drainage. Fluids extracted from the body by the natron drained away continuously. Some of this liquid was collected and preserved. It had come from the deceased and was considered part of them. Nothing was wasted. The body remained in natron for 40 days. This duration had been determined through centuries of empirical observation. 40 days removed sufficient water to prevent decay, while not over-desiccating the skin to the point of fragility and disintegration. During this period, remarkable changes occurred. The body lost approximately 75% of its original weight. Nearly all of this weight loss was water. An individual weighing 160 pounds in life would weigh approximately 40 pounds after complete desiccation. The skin darkened and took on a leathery texture. It remained intact if the process was performed correctly, but all pliability was lost. The tissue became firm and stable. Facial features changed as underlying tissues reduced in volume. The face took on a more angular appearance. The eyes receded as the tissues around them contracted. The internal organs, preserved separately in their own natron containers, underwent identical transformation. After 40 days, they too were completely dried and stable. At the 40-day point, the embalmers uncovered the body. The natron was carefully brushed away. Every surface was inspected thoroughly. The embalmers checked for any areas where moisture might remain. If any tissue showed incomplete desiccation, the body was recovered with fresh natron for additional time. Most bodies completed the process in 40 days. Some required up to 70, but 40 days was typical. Once satisfied that all moisture had been removed, the embalmers cleaned the body. Residual natron was brushed off. The body was wiped gently with scented water. Natron residue could damage the dried skin over time if not removed. The skin was then treated with oils. Juniper oil, cedarwood oil, and myrrh oil were commonly used. These oils penetrated the dried tissue, restoring a degree of flexibility. They also possessed antimicrobial properties, providing additional protection against any remaining microorganisms. Particular attention was paid to the face. Linen pads soaked in resin were sometimes placed beneath the facial skin to restore more natural contours. This made the deceased appear more as they had in life. The eyes, now receded deeply, were covered with linen pads. In some cases, small onions were placed in the eye sockets. The round shape approximated the appearance of eyes and prevented the lids from collapsing inward. The nostrils were packed with linen. This prevented the nose from collapsing and maintained its shape. The mouth was closed and sometimes secured with thread or filled with linen to keep the lips in position. The abdominal cavity, previously packed with natron during evisceration, was now emptied of that desiccating material and cleaned one final time with palm wine. The cavity was then filled with materials meant to restore the body's natural shape. Linen, sawdust, or sand were commonly used. Sometimes packets of natron were included to absorb any residual moisture. Aromatic resins were sometimes added. The goal was to make the body appear as it had in life. The evisceration incision on the left side was covered with a protective plate. This might be made of metal, leather, linen, or wax. The plate was often decorated with the Eye of Horus, a sacred protective symbol. The body was now ready for the most visible aspect of mummification: the wrapping. Multiple layers of linen would protect the body, hold it together, and transform it from preserved remains into a sacred object prepared for eternity. Chapter 5. The wrapping. Binding the body for eternity. The preserved body now required protection. The wrapping process would take approximately 15 days. Layer upon layer of linen would be applied. Each layer served both practical and spiritual purposes. The body would be transformed from fragile dried tissue into a secure, protected form capable of enduring indefinitely. The process began with the extremities. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually with thin linen strips. This protected these delicate structures. The desiccation process had made them fragile. The wrapping held them securely and prevented damage. Individual fingers were wrapped first, beginning at the tips and progressing to the base. Then the entire hand was wrapped as a unit, all 5 fingers together. The thumb was positioned across the palm. The fingers were straightened. The hand became a solid, protected bundle. The same careful process was applied to each foot. Individual toes were wrapped, then the foot as a whole. The methodology was systematic and deliberate. Nothing was rushed. The arms and legs required longer strips of linen. The embalmers wound cloth around these limbs, beginning at the hands and feet and progressing toward the torso. Each revolution overlapped the previous one by approximately half its width. This created multiple protective layers. As the wrapping progressed, amulets were positioned between the linen layers. These were not decorative. They served protective and magical functions. Each amulet had specific power and required specific placement. The Djed pillar amulet was placed on the back, at the base of the spine. This symbol represented stability and the backbone of Osiris. It was believed to provide strength for the deceased to stand in the afterlife. The Tayet knot, representing the knot of Isis, was positioned near the chest. This symbol, often carved from red jasper to represent the color of blood and life, provided protection from the goddess Isis. The heart scarab was placed over the position of the heart. This was perhaps the most important amulet. The scarab was inscribed with Chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead, a spell intended to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased during the weighing judgment. The inscription read, "O my heart of my mother, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal." The deceased needed this protection. Everyone had committed some wrongdoing in life. The heart scarab helped ensure favorable judgment. The ujjat, the eye of Horus, was positioned near the embalming incision. This symbol represented healing and restoration. According to mythology, Horus's eye was damaged in battle with Set, but was healed by Thoth. The ujjat made the body symbolically whole again. For wealthy individuals, thin sheets of gold were sometimes fashioned into finger and toe caps. These were placed over the wrapped digits. Gold represented the flesh of the gods. Covering extremities in gold made them symbolically divine. The wrapping continued to the torso. Linen was wound around the chest and abdomen in systematic layers. The wrapped arms were positioned according to established convention, sometimes placed at the sides, sometimes crossed over the chest. Position often indicated gender or status. More amulets were added between layers as the wrapping progressed. Royal mummies might have hundreds of protective amulets. Common individuals had fewer, but even the poorest burials included some minimal protection for the journey ahead. The head required special attention. Facial features needed to be preserved. The form had to remain recognizable. The kai and ba required the ability to identify this body as theirs. Linen pads were placed over the closed eyes, conforming to the contours of the lids. The nose was wrapped carefully to maintain its shape. The mouth was wrapped closed. The jaw was secured in position. Then the entire head was wrapped, beginning at the crown and progressing downward to the neck. Multiple layers were applied. The head became smooth and rounded. Individual features disappeared beneath the protective linen. Once the entire body was wrapped in multiple layers, a shroud was placed over everything. A large linen sheet covered the mummy from head to foot. Sometimes this shroud was plain. Sometimes it was painted with religious imagery. Sometimes spells from the Book of the Dead were written upon it. The shroud was secured with horizontal linen bands wound around the mummy. These bands held everything tightly in place. The mummy was now a solid, secure bundle, firm, protected, stable. For those who could afford additional protection, a final layer was added: cartonnage. This consisted of linen or papyrus material soaked in resin. The soaked material was molded over the wrapped mummy while still pliable. As the resin dried, it hardened into a protective shell. The cartonnage was then decorated. Gold leaf was often applied to the face. Facial features were painted in detail. Eyes were outlined. Eyebrows were defined. The face was rendered in idealized form. Young, perfect, representing how the deceased wished to appear for eternity, rather than how they looked at death. The cartonnage extended down the body and was painted with religious imagery. The deceased was depicted wearing fine clothing and jewelry. Scenes showed offerings to deities. Protective gods were rendered. Every available surface carried religious iconography. For royal burials, cartonnage was sometimes replaced by masks of hammered gold. The most famous example is the mask of Tutankhamun. 11 kilograms of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian. The face serene, perfect, eternal. But regardless of wealth or status, every mummy received reverent treatment. The wrapping was prayer made physical. Each revolution of linen was accompanied by spoken incantations. The embalmers recited continuously, invoking divine protection. requesting safe passage, ensuring the deceased's success in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead provided many of these recitations: spells for going forth by day, spells for activating the Shabti servant figures, hymns to Ra, the sun god who died each night and was reborn each dawn. The deceased hoped for similar resurrection. The embalmers knew these texts thoroughly. They recited them from memory as they worked. The wrapping became extended ceremony, ritual lasting 15 days. At its conclusion, the mummy was complete. The physical preservation was finished. Now the spiritual activation would begin. Chapter 6. The opening of the mouth, restoring the senses. The wrapped mummy was preserved but not yet functional. According to Egyptian belief, the wrapping had closed the senses. The mouth could not consume the offerings that would be placed before it. The eyes could not see. The ears could not hear the prayers. Before the mummy could function in the afterlife, these senses required ritual restoration. The opening of the mouth ceremony accomplished this activation. It was performed on the 70th day, the final day of the mummification process. The day the mummy would be delivered to the tomb. The ceremony occurred at the tomb entrance. The mummy was positioned upright, propped against a support or held by assistants. It faced south toward the land of the living. Behind it, to the north, was the tomb entrance leading to the realm of the dead. The family gathered as witnesses. The Sem priest, distinguished by the leopard skin worn over his shoulder, approached carrying ritual implements: an adze, a peseshkef knife, a rod. Each tool had been used in the consecration of divine statues. Each carried sacred power. The ceremony began with purification. Water was sprinkled on the mummy. Natron was scattered. Incense was burned. Cedar, myrrh, and frankincense filled the air with sacred smoke. The smoke was believed to carry prayers to the divine realm. The Sem priest recited the opening formula. The mouth was closed. I have come to open the mouth. I have come to open the eyes. I have opened the ears. I have come that I may restore your senses. He touched the mummy's mouth with the adze. This tool was made of iron, specifically meteoritic iron that had fallen from the sky. This connected the earthly ceremony to the heavens. He touched the eyes, the nose, the ears. Each contact was accompanied by specific incantations. Your mouth was bound. I have loosened your mouth. You shall speak with the gods as you spoke in life. A ritual slaughter was performed. A calf was brought forward and killed according to religious protocol. The right foreleg was removed and held ceremonially against the mummy's mouth. This represented the first sustenance the deceased would receive in their new existence. Additional recitations followed. Chapter 23 of the Book of the Dead. The spell for opening the mouth. My mouth is opened by Ptah. The bonds of my mouth are loosened by the god of my city. Thoth comes fully equipped with spells. He loosens the bonds from my mouth. The ceremony was elaborate and lengthy. Multiple priests participated. Different incantations addressed different parts of the body. The arms were ritually liberated. The legs were freed. The heart was activated. Each component was restored to function through spoken formula and ritual gesture. Offerings were presented on an altar before the mummy. Bread, beer, meat, vegetables, linen cloth, incense. Everything the deceased would require. The deceased could now consume these offerings spiritually, sustaining the car. Family members participated in ritual mourning. The deceased's wife or mother performed prescribed gestures of grief, tearing garments, placing dust on the head, wailing in formalized patterns. This display was expected. It demonstrated that the deceased had been loved, was valued, would be remembered. Professional mourners were often hired for significant burials, women who specialized in funeral lamentation. They understood the proper forms, the correct gestures. Their mourning was theatrical, but performed with genuine respect for the deceased and the process. Throughout the ceremony, musicians provided accompaniment: drums, rattles, stringed instruments. The rhythmic sound helped create the appropriate atmosphere for this sacred transition. At the ceremony's conclusion, the Sem priest made the final declaration: "You live again. You live forever. Behold, you are renewed forever." The mummy was now activated. The senses were open. The soul components could inhabit this preserved body. The Ka could enter. The Ba could return each night. The mummy was prepared for placement in its eternal resting place. But before final burial, other preparations had been completed during the 70-day mummification process. The canopic jars containing the preserved organs had been finished. The tomb had been furnished and decorated. Everything the deceased would need for eternal existence had been gathered. Chapter 7. The canopic jars and tomb preparation. While the body underwent its 70-day transformation, the removed organs underwent parallel preservation. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. Each had been dried in natron. Each was wrapped in linen. Each would be placed in its designated container. The canopic jars were manufactured from limestone, calcite, or pottery, depending on the family's resources. Each jar was carefully crafted and smoothed. The surfaces were often inscribed with protective spells from the Book of the Dead, particularly Chapter 17, which invoked the 4 sons of Horus. Each jar was associated with a specific guardian deity and direction. Imseti, the human-headed son of Horus, guarded the liver. He was associated with the south and protected by the goddess Isis. Hapi, the baboon-headed son, guarded the lungs. He was associated with the north and protected by the goddess Nephthys. Duamutef, the jackal-headed son, guarded the stomach. He was associated with the east and protected by the goddess Neith. Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed son, guarded the intestines. He was associated with the west and protected by the goddess Selket. The jar lids were carved to represent these guardians: human face, baboon face, jackal face, falcon face. The lids fitted tightly and were sealed with resin for additional security. The 4 jars were placed in a canopic chest, a wooden or stone container with 4 internal compartments. Each jar sat in its designated position. The chest exterior was carved with protective inscriptions and painted with images of the guardian goddesses. This chest would be positioned in the tomb near the sarcophagus. The organs would remain close to the body. In the afterlife, they would be reunited with the deceased. The person would be complete again. Simultaneously, the tomb itself was being prepared. For royal burials, this preparation had often begun years before death. Tombs were carved into bedrock. Corridors extended deep into cliff faces. Multiple chambers were excavated. Walls were plastered and painted. The tomb walls were covered with texts and imagery. The Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns. These texts served as guides through the underworld. Each gate mentioned in the texts had a guardian. Each guardian required specific passwords. The texts provided the necessary knowledge. The tomb was furnished according to the deceased's status and resources. A bed was placed in one chamber. Chairs, tables, storage chests containing linen clothing. The deceased would need these items for eternal use. Food offerings were brought to the tomb: jars of grain, dried fish, preserved meat, dates, figs, wine, beer, bread. While these physical offerings would eventually decay, Egyptian belief held that the Ka consumed the spiritual essence, which remained available indefinitely. Shabti figures were positioned throughout the tomb. These small, mummy-shaped statues served as magical servants. For wealthy burials, hundreds of shabtis might be included. These figures would perform labor if the deceased was called to work in the afterlife fields. Each shabti was inscribed with the activation spell, O Shabti, if the deceased is called to perform work in the realm of the dead, you shall say, Here I am, I shall do it. Games were included among the burial goods. Senet boards with playing pieces were common. This game was believed to have spiritual significance. Playing it was thought to help navigate challenges in the afterlife. Weapons were placed in the tomb, a bow with arrows, a dagger. These were not for aggression, but for protection. The journey through the underworld involved dangers, hostile entities. The deceased needed means of defense. Jewelry was included, necklaces, bracelets, rings, amulets. Each piece had protective properties according to Egyptian belief. Lapis lazuli was thought to deflect negative forces. Carnelian provided strength. Gold conferred divine qualities. The sarcophagus was positioned in the burial chamber. This stone container would hold the coffin. For royal burials, sarcophagi were carved from granite or quartzite. The exterior was inscribed with protective spells. The interior often featured carved images of the sky goddess, Nut, who would embrace and protect the deceased. The coffin sat inside the sarcophagus. Wealthy burials often included multiple nested coffins, 2 or 3 layers. Each was more elaborate than the one outside it. The innermost coffin was often anthropoid, shaped like a human form. The face was carved and painted. The body was decorated with imagery of feathered wings. The design transformed the deceased symbolically into a divine being prepared for celestial ascent. Everything was arranged. The tomb was stocked. The canopic jars were completed. The sarcophagus was positioned. The coffin awaited its occupant. The 70 days had passed. The moment had arrived for the family's final farewell. The funeral procession. The journey from the world of the living to the realm of the eternal. Chapter 8. The Funeral Procession. Journey to the West. The 70th day marked the culmination of all preparation. The mummy was complete. The opening of the mouth ceremony had been performed. The body now required transport to its final resting place. The funeral procession assembled at dawn. The mummy in its coffin was placed on a sledge. This was a wooden platform with runners designed to slide across sand and stone. Oxen were harnessed to pull the sledge. For important burials, teams of men pulled it with ropes instead, demonstrating their respect through personal effort. The procession moved at a deliberate pace. This journey was not to be rushed. This represented the deceased's final passage through the realm of the living. Priests walked at the front of the procession. They carried incense burners. The smoke rose continuously, marking the route and performing ritual purification. Behind them came musicians. Drums maintained a slow, steady rhythm. Flutes played ceremonial melodies. The sound announced the procession to all who heard it. Passers-by stopped and showed respect. Some joined the procession if they had known the deceased. The Sem priest walked beside the coffin. He wore his leopard skin and carried his staff. He recited protective formulas continuously, guarding the deceased during this vulnerable transition period. Professional mourners walked behind the coffin. Women with loosened hair and dust-marked faces. They performed ritual gestures of grief. Arms raised to the sky. Hands touching their heads, wailing in prescribed patterns. This display was required. The more elaborate the mourning, the greater honor shown to the deceased. The family walked behind the professional mourners. The widow or widower, the children, siblings and parents if surviving. Their grief was quieter, more internalized. The professional mourners performed the theatrical aspects. The family's sorrow was personal and profound. Servants carried the funeral goods, the canopic chest, boxes of Shabti figures, furniture pieces. The procession resembled a moving household. Everything the deceased owned in life now moved toward the tomb. Royal funerals involved hundreds of participants. The route was lined with crowds. Thousands came to witness. A king's death affected the entire nation. Collective mourning was expected. The procession reached the Nile or a canal. Water had to be crossed. This crossing carried symbolic weight. The Nile separated the eastern bank, the land of the living where the sun rose, from the western bank, the land of the dead where the sun set. All major cemeteries were located on the west bank. The coffin was loaded onto a ceremonial boat. This vessel was specifically constructed or designated for funeral use, painted and decorated with images of protective deities. The boat was towed across the water by another vessel or rowed by priests. During the crossing, additional incantations were recited. Chapter 99 of the Book of the Dead, the spell for bringing a boat in the underworld. My boat is assembled and launched. I sail across to where I wish to be. I am the Lord of Eternity crossing the sky. On the western bank, the procession reformed. The sledge was unloaded from the boat. The pulling resumed. The route now led into the desert, toward the cliffs where tombs were carved into living rock. The desert landscape was barren, harsh, lifeless. This environment was considered appropriate for the dead, far from the fertile valley, distant from growing things, in the austere purity of sand and stone. The path climbed upward, the cliffs rose ahead, tombs were carved at elevation. This made them more difficult for robbers to access, but it also carried symbolic meaning, rising toward the sky, ascending toward the realm of the gods. At the tomb entrance, the procession halted. The coffin was removed from the sledge and positioned upright. The opening of the mouth ceremony had been performed earlier, but a final activation occurred at this moment. The seam priest touched the mouth one final time. Your mouth is opened. You shall speak. Final offerings were presented. An ox was slaughtered according to ritual protocol. The meat was piled before the tomb entrance. Bread, beer, vegetables, incense. The offerings were abundant. This would be the last occasion for the family to physically provide for the deceased. The car would consume these offerings spiritually. The family needed to give generously this final time. Family members addressed the deceased directly. They spoke promises to remember, to bring regular offerings to the tomb, to speak the name. They assured the deceased that memory would continue, that they would not be forgotten. Then came the most difficult moment. The coffin was carried into the tomb, down the corridor, into the burial chamber. The sarcophagus lid had been opened in preparation. The coffin was carefully lowered inside. The canopic chest was positioned beside the sarcophagus. The Shabti figures were arranged in their designated locations. Furniture was placed. Food offerings were distributed. Everything was arranged precisely as planned. The family stood at the burial chamber entrance. They looked one final time at the coffin containing their beloved, preserved, protected, prepared for eternity, but departed from daily life. The massive stone lid of the sarcophagus was lowered into position. Several men applied their strength. The stone slid into place with a resonant sound that echoed through the chamber. The seal was complete. The family retreated through the corridor. At the tomb entrance, they paused, turned, took one final look into the darkness where their beloved now rested. The tomb entrance was then sealed. Priests applied plaster over the opening. They pressed the necropolis seal into the wet plaster, the jackal of Anubis above 9 bound prisoners. The symbol of security and royal protection. The tomb was officially closed. The plaster would harden. Desert sand would drift over the entrance. Within a short time, the tomb would become nearly invisible in the cliff face. Hidden, protected, or so the family hoped. They turned away, began the journey back to the valley, back to the land of the living. The funeral was complete. The mummification was complete. The deceased now resided in the realm of the dead. The family returned home to grieve privately and begin the long process of continuing life in the absence of their beloved. But according to Egyptian belief, the deceased's journey was just beginning. The navigation of the underworld awaited, the Hall of Two Truths, the weighing of the heart, the final judgment, and if successful, eternal life in the field of reeds, paradise, forever. Chapter 9. The Weighing of the Heart, Judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. Egyptian belief held that death was not an end, but a transition. The deceased would awaken in the tomb. The preserved body would house the returning Bay and Ka. Consciousness would resume. And the journey through the Duat, the underworld, would begin. This journey involved navigating 12 gates. Each gate was guarded by a deity who required specific passwords. The Book of the Dead provided these passwords. They had been written on papyrus placed in the tomb, inscribed on tomb walls, painted on the coffin. The deceased had access to this knowledge. At each gate, the deceased would recite the appropriate formula. I know you and I know your name. Your name is specific name. I pass through you. With correct knowledge, each gate would open. The journey would continue. Along the route, challenges appeared. Serpents emerged. Demons threatened. But the deceased was equipped with protective spells. Each threat could be countered with proper recitation from the Book of the Dead. Eventually, the deceased arrived at the Hall of Two Truths, an enormous chamber. According to the text, the ceiling was the night sky, stars visible overhead. The floor was polished stone. At the far end sat Osiris, king of the dead and god of resurrection. His skin was depicted as green, the color of vegetation and renewal. He held the crook and flail, symbols of kingship. He wore the Atef crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt flanked by ostrich feathers. Beside Osiris sat the 42 judges. Each represented a specific sin. Each would question the deceased. In the center of the hall stood the Great Balance, 2 pans suspended from a beam. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stood beside it with his scribe's palette. He would record the result. Anubis, the jackal-headed god who presided over mummification, tended the balance. He would ensure accurate measurement. The deceased approached. The hall fell silent. All attention focused on this critical moment. According to the texts, the spiritual heart was removed from the deceased's chest and placed on one pan of the balance. On the other pan was placed the feather of Ma'at, a single white ostrich feather representing truth, justice, and cosmic order. The balance began to move. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, the heart pan would descend. If light with righteousness, it would balance against the feather. The heart scarab amulet, placed over the physical heart during mummification, served its purpose now. Inscribed with chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead, it prevented the heart from testifying against the deceased. The deceased recited the spell, "O my heart, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal." If the recitation was correct, the heart would balance against the feather. But the test continued. The negative confession followed. The deceased had to declare innocence of 42 specific sins. Each declaration addressed one of the judges. I have done no wrong. I have not stolen. I have not been greedy. I have not killed. I have not lied. I have not committed adultery. I have not caused pain. I have not been arrogant. I have not cursed. I have not been deaf to truth. The confession continued through all 42 declarations. Each sin denied. Each judge satisfied. These declarations were ritual formula. Perfection was not required. Correct recitation was what mattered. Knowledge of the proper words demonstrated preparation, devotion, worthiness. If all formulas were recited correctly, if the heart balanced against the feather, Thoth would make his declaration. The heart of the deceased balances against the feather of Ma'at. Truth is satisfied. The deceased is justified. Osiris would then speak. You are pure. You are righteous. You may enter the field of reeds. You may dwell among the blessed dead. You are granted eternity. But failure had consequences. Beside the scales lurked Amit the devourer. Her front was crocodile. Her middle was lion. Her rear was hippopotamus. The three most dangerous animals of Egypt combined into one entity. If the heart failed the weighing, if it was heavy with unconfessed sin, if the formulas were recited incorrectly, Amit would consume the heart. The deceased would suffer the second death, final death. The soul components would dissolve, true oblivion. This was the fate Egyptians feared most. Not death itself, but this final extinction, the end of all existence. For those who passed judgment, Horus would guide them from the Hall of Two Truths to the Field of Reeds, a paradise, green fields extending to the horizon, the Nile flowing through it, trees bearing fruit, perfect weather, eternal contentment. The deceased would reunite with loved ones who had passed before, would feast on inexhaustible offerings, would exist in perfection forever. The Shabti figures would perform any required labor. Life would continue in ideal form. This was the goal of mummification. The entire elaborate 70-day process aimed toward this moment. Preservation of the body enabled preservation of the soul. The wrappings protected, the amulets guarded, the spells provided knowledge. Everything worked together to ensure safe passage through judgment and entry into eternal life. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization believed in this system absolutely. Millions were mummified. Millions made the journey. The culture invested enormous resources in preparing for this transition, until everything changed, until foreign civilizations arrived who did not understand, who saw these sacred preparations as curiosities, as objects, as commodities. Chapter 10. The Victorian Encounter. When understanding failed. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 brought European attention to ancient Egyptian civilization. He brought soldiers who conquered territory and scholars who documented what they found. These scholars measured monuments, sketched reliefs, copied inscriptions. They published their findings in massive volumes titled Description de l'Égypte. These publications introduced Europe to the grandeur of ancient Egypt, and Europe developed an intense fascination. Egyptian artifacts began flowing into European collections. Obelisks were transported to Paris, London, and New York. Statues were removed from temple sites. Tombs were excavated, often rapidly and without proper archaeological method. The goal was extraction of objects for sale or display. Mummies became particularly desirable. Museums wanted specimens. Private collectors sought them. The demand was substantial, and Egypt's ancient cemeteries held thousands of preserved remains. Giovanni Belzoni exemplified this era. An Italian circus strongman who became an archaeological excavator, he forced entry into the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings in 1817. The tomb was magnificent. Corridors decorated with painted reliefs. Chambers that had contained treasures. Belzoni removed everything transportable, shipped it to England, sold it to collectors and institutions. In his published accounts, Belzoni described encountering burial chambers containing numerous mummified remains. He treated these as obstacles, rather than as individuals who had undergone sacred preservation. His focus was reaching sarcophagi and artifacts, not understanding or respecting the deceased. British consul Henry Salt acquired mummies in large quantities. He sold them to whoever would purchase them. Some went to museums for study and display. Some went to private collectors as curiosities. The practice was commercial. Public mummy unwrapping became entertainment. Thomas Pettigrew performed his first public unwrapping in London in 1833. The event was extremely popular. He repeated it dozens of times over subsequent years. Tickets sold at premium prices. Large audiences gathered to watch. Pettigrew approached the unwrappings with scientific interest. He took detailed notes, made measurements, published findings. But the audiences were not primarily interested in science. They attended for the spectacle, the experience of witnessing something ancient and hidden being revealed. The unwrappings followed a pattern. Pettigrew would lecture first, explaining Egyptian beliefs and practices. Then he would begin cutting the wrappings. The audience watched as layers fell away. When objects appeared between the linen, when the body was finally exposed, the audience responded with intense interest. After unwrapping, the remains were often further examined. Skulls were measured, teeth were inspected, samples were sometimes taken. What remained after examination was sometimes divided among collectors, but mummies served other purposes beyond study and display. They were ground into powder and sold as medicine. Mummy, as a medicinal substance, had confused origins, possibly related to Persian bitumen. But by the Victorian era, actual mummified tissue was being processed and sold. European apothecaries offered mummy powder. It was prescribed for various ailments. The practice had no medical validity. Thousands of preserved remains were destroyed for this purpose. Mummies were also processed into pigment. A paint colour called mummy brown was manufactured by grinding mummified tissue and mixing it with binding oils. The colour had a particular warm brown tone that some artists valued. Pre-Raphaelite painters used mummy brown. Some reportedly ceased using it when they learned its source. Edward Burne-Jones allegedly gave his tube of mummy brown a funeral, burying it in his garden. But many artists continued using the pigment. Production continued into the 1960s, when the supply of remains available for grinding finally diminished. There are also historical accounts, possibly exaggerated but based on some reality, of mummies being used as fuel. In the mid-1800s, when mummies were abundant and inexpensive in Egypt, some were reportedly burned. The resin-soaked linen provided combustible material. Victorian homes were furnished with Egyptian objects. Mummy cases served as decorative elements, displayed in parlours and libraries. The painted faces and carved hieroglyphs were treated as exotic decoration. The warnings against disturbance that many of these objects carried were unread or ignored. Some families displayed unwrapped mummies in glass cases. These were shown to visitors, discussed at social gatherings. The disconnect between what these remains represented to their creators and how they were being treated was complete. Jewelry was manufactured from mummy beads. The small faience amulets that had been placed with the deceased for protection were collected, restrung, and sold as Egyptian jewelry. Worn to social events, treated as fashion accessories. Photography, a new technology, found subjects in mummies. Photographers posed preserved remains, created staged scenes. Some photographs show mummies arranged in unnatural positions for dramatic effect. The Cairo Museum, established in the late 1800s, attempted to preserve Egyptian cultural heritage within Egypt. But even there, mummies were displayed in rows behind glass, numbered, labelled, available for public viewing. When the cache of royal mummies was discovered at Deir el-Bahari in 1881, 40 mummies of kings and queens were found. Ancient priests had hidden them to protect them from robbery. The protection ultimately failed. The mummies were removed, transported to Cairo, unwrapped for study, and placed on display. These were Egypt's greatest rulers: Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, individuals who had commanded empires, built monuments, been worshipped as divine. Their preserved remains became museum exhibits, viewed by tourists, photographed, studied by scholars, but also treated as curiosities. In more recent decades, attitudes have shifted. The practice of displaying human remains has become controversial. Many museums have removed human remains from display, or have created more respectful presentation contexts. Some remains have been repatriated to descendant communities. Egyptian mummies present a complex case. Ancient Egyptian religion is extinct. No one practices the rituals. No one makes the offerings. No direct descendants can claim cultural continuity. The connection to the original culture has been severed. Modern study of mummies has become more respectful and less invasive. CT scanning allows examination without unwrapping. Chemical analysis can be performed on minimal samples. Three-dimensional modeling provides information without physical manipulation. Technology enables learning without destruction. But the historical damage cannot be undone. Thousands of mummies were destroyed through unwrapping, grinding, burning, and other uses. The carefully preserved bodies, the products of 70 days of skilled work, the expressions of love and hope for eternity, destroyed by people who did not understand or did not care. The Egyptians who created these mummies believed they were providing eternal life. They believed the preserved body would house the soul forever. They believed their beloved would live in paradise. The reality proved different. The bodies did survive for millennia. The preservation techniques worked remarkably well, but the cultural context did not survive. When Egyptian religion ceased, when the rituals stopped, the mummies lost their sacred status. They became objects, and objects could be bought, sold, displayed, destroyed. What remains now are the mummies still in museums and collections worldwide, thousands of them. Some displayed respectfully with educational context, some stored in archives, all representing individuals who underwent this elaborate preservation process with the hope of eternity. We cannot restore what was lost. We cannot resurrect the beliefs. We cannot perform the rituals as they were originally intended. All we can do is treat the remaining mummies with greater respect than previous generations did. Recognize them as individuals who were loved, who were carefully prepared for eternity, and ensure that respect is maintained. Epilogue. What endures when beliefs change? The complete process of mummification required 70 days. Evisceration, brain removal, desiccation, wrapping, opening of the mouth, burial with provisions for eternity. Each step was precisely executed. Each carried both practical and spiritual significance. The result was not merely a preserved body, but a prepared vessel for eternal existence. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization devoted extraordinary resources to death preparation. The pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, the elaborate tombs, the mummies themselves. This was not morbid obsession, but profound engagement with mortality and what might lie beyond. Modern observers sometimes struggle to understand this investment. Why spend 70 days preparing a body? Why fill tombs with provisions the dead cannot use? Why develop such elaborate mythology about the afterlife? The answer lies in what these practices provided to the living as much as to the deceased. The 70-day mummification process gave families time to process loss. Structured time, with specific tasks, specific rituals. Grief was given form and purpose. The tomb preparation provided ongoing connection. Visiting the tomb to leave offerings maintained relationship with the deceased. Speaking the name kept memory alive. The physical presence of the tomb, the preserved body, the carefully maintained provisions, all served to make death less absolute. The deceased was transformed, not erased. We have largely abandoned these practices. Modern death is handled quickly. Bodies are prepared by professionals out of family view. Funerals are brief. We return to work within days. This efficiency has costs. Grief in modern context often lacks structure. No required tasks extending over 70 days. No daily offerings to maintain connection. We are told to move on, to let go, to return to normal. But grief does not follow efficient timelines. Loss is not resolved quickly. The Egyptians understood something we have forgotten. They provided frameworks that honored grief's reality. That gave it time. That offered specific actions when words failed. The embalmers were not just preserving bodies. They were supporting families through impossible transition. We have also lost direct engagement with death. Ancient Egyptians witnessed the mummification process. They understood what happened to the body. Death was not hidden or sanitized. It was present, visible, integrated into life. Modern death is invisible. We rarely see actual death. Hospitals and funeral homes manage it. Bodies appear briefly, prepared to look peaceful, then disappear. We see almost nothing of the actual physical reality. This invisibility breeds fear. What we hide becomes frightening. The Egyptians made death visible and ritualized it. The process was intensive, but it was known and understood. Families knew exactly what would happen. There were no mysteries to fear. Most significantly, we have lost the concept that preservation matters. The Egyptians believed preserving the body preserved the person in important ways. We know this is not literally true in their religious sense, but metaphorically, they recognize something valid. Preservation enables memory. Physical remains create focus for remembrance. The tomb becomes a place to visit. The name carved in stone remains readable. The possessions buried with the deceased remind us who they were. When we cremate and scatter ashes, nothing physical persists. The person exists only in memory, and memory fades. Within 2 or 3 generations, most people are completely forgotten. They existed, but left no trace. The Egyptian approach was opposite. The mummy could last thousands of years. The tomb was permanent. The name was carved in stone. Physical evidence prevented complete forgetting. This is why the Victorian-era destruction was so significant. Each unwrapped mummy was an individual erased. Each ground-up mummy was someone forgotten. Each burned mummy was evidence eliminated. The last physical connections to real people were severed. People who had lived, who had been loved, who had hoped for eternity. We cannot undo that damage. The mummies remaining in museums are all we have. We should treat them with the respect they deserved originally. Not as curiosities or objects, but as individuals, preserved with great care by people who loved them, who wanted them to endure forever. Modern technology allows study without violation. We can learn from mummies without destroying them. CT scans, chemical analysis of tiny samples, 3-dimensional modeling. We can honor the original intent while pursuing knowledge, but we should also recognize what we are preserving and why. These bodies were not created for our education. They were created for eternity, for housing souls, for maintaining connections between the living and the dead. We cannot provide that original purpose. We cannot restore the beliefs. We cannot make offerings to their cars. We cannot speak their names in the ritually correct manner. The religious system is extinct. The connection is broken. What we can do is remember that these were people. Recognize that they were loved. Understand that enormous effort went into their preservation, and treat them accordingly. The complete process of mummification was a testament to love. to devotion, to the human refusal to accept death as absolute ending. For 70 days, embalmers worked, carefully, precisely, transforming remains into something designed to last millennia. They succeeded. The mummies endured. They survived 3,000 years. The preservation techniques worked beyond any reasonable expectation. What did not endure was the belief system. When Egyptian religion ceased, when Christianity and Islam replaced it, the context was lost. The mummies remained, but no one made offerings. No one spoke the names ritually. No one believed the car would return. The mummies became relics of an extinct faith, objects without living meaning. This made them vulnerable. Sacred objects are protected. Mere antiquities can be bought, sold, displayed, destroyed. This is what we lost. Not the physical bodies. Many survive. But the understanding of what they represented, the reverence for the dead, the recognition that how we treat remains matters, the knowledge that death need not end all connection. The Egyptians knew something we have forgotten but might remember. The dead remain with us, not literally, but in memory, in influence, in the traces they leave. Honoring the dead honors that continuing connection. Preserving the body is one way to do that, not the only way, but a meaningful way. We have different methods now. Photographs preserve faces, videos preserve voices, digital archives preserve words. These are our attempts at immortality, our refusal to let death erase those we love. The impulse is identical. The Egyptians who spent 70 days mummifying their beloved and the person who creates a photo album of a deceased parent are doing the same thing. Refusing to forget, maintaining connection, preserving what can be preserved. The technology differs. The underlying human need does not. We need to remember, we need to honor, we need to believe that those who came before us still matter, that their lives had meaning, that their deaths are not the end of their significance. The mummies teach us this, not through their physical existence alone, but through the effort that created them. Someone loved the person inside those wrappings, loved them enough to ensure 70 days of skilled work, to fill a tomb with provisions, to commission prayers and spells, to ensure everything was done correctly. That love is visible in every layer of linen, every amulet placed between wrappings, every spell carved on the coffin. The mummy is love made tangible, preservation made permanent, hope given physical form. The 70 days of mummification were not wasted. The bodies lasted, the process worked. The love that motivated it was real and powerful. And that love deserves to be remembered, honored, preserved, just as the mummies themselves were preserved, with care, with precision, with devotion, for 70 days and for eternity beyond. The ancient Egyptians confronted mortality directly. They developed sophisticated responses to death that served both the deceased and the surviving family. The mummification process was technology, religion, art, science, and love combined into a single comprehensive system. We can learn from this, not by adopting their specific beliefs, but by recognizing what they understood, that death deserves attention, that the dead deserve honor, that preservation of memory matters, that grief needs structure and time, that love continues beyond death. The mummies that remain are testimony to all of this. They endure not just as preserved tissue, but as evidence of human devotion, of our refusal to accept death as absolute, of our need to remember and to honor those who came before. May we treat them with the respect this represents. May we remember what they teach. And may we apply those lessons to how we honor our own dead in our own time with our own methods. The process was 70 days. The result was meant to last forever. In important ways, it has.